I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com.
Alzheimer's disease is devastating. As the brain fails, people lose their memories and ultimately their identities. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
After decades of research and billions of dollars spent in drug development, we still do not have really effective treatment for dementia.
The amyloid hypothesis has dominated pharmaceutical research. The FDA has approved 3 new drugs that reduce amyloid, but they don't cure the disease.
Today's guests will reveal evidence of scientific misconduct in foundational studies in the field.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, exposing fraud, arrogance, and tragedy in the quest to cure Alzheimer's.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, epidemiologists are starting to call this winter's combination of influenza, COVID-19, RSV, and norovirus a quaddemic. And that does not include colds, which are also spreading. It's a little more challenging than usual to track such infections because the CDC is operating under communication restrictions. However, the data that are available indicate that influenza A, respiratory syncytial virus, and COVID-19 have all been increasing since Thanksgiving. Norovirus appears to be more active than it has been for several years. This severe gastrointestinal infection can lead to dangerous dehydration and is extremely contagious. We hope that people experiencing any of these conditions will be able to stay home and take care of themselves, rather than trying to go on with their ordinary tasks and spreading the germs around. Public health experts also recommend conscientious hand washing, disinfection of potentially contaminated surfaces, and even face masks, unless you're certain that the space you'll be in has excellent ventilation.
A respiratory tract infection that most Americans have almost forgotten has just emerged in Kansas. Active tuberculosis has been detected in about 70 people, making it the largest outbreak in U.S. recorded history. What makes this especially scary is that TB is easy to catch and hard to treat. Like other respiratory infections, the Mycobacterium tuberculosis pathogen spreads through the air. It can remain airborne for several hours. People need to take specialized antibiotics for up to 9 months, depending upon each case. Multi-drug resistant strains of TB may require treatment for up to 2 years. There's an effective vaccine against TB called BCG, but it's not usually used in the U.S.
Despite the attention we're paying to infectious diseases, the country's number one killer has not changed for 100 years. Cardiovascular disease killed more than 900,000 Americans in 2022, which is the latest data available. That's up from 2021. Such statistics are alarming because 50 million Americans are currently taking statin-type cholesterol-lowering medications that are supposed to reduce their risk for heart attacks and strokes. In addition, the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology have worked very hard to promote blood pressure control at a level of 120/80 or lower. And we now have a number of highly effective medications to help control obesity. Because symptoms of a cardiovascular condition sometimes overlap with those of a respiratory infection, people who are having breathing difficulties or palpitations should seek medical attention promptly.
So-called forever chemicals have been used in consumer products since the 1940s, and we're still dealing with them. These per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS for short, do not break down in nature and readily get into animal and human bodies. A recent study measured the levels of various types of PFAS in municipal water on a county-by-county basis. The researchers then tracked the occurrence of specific cancers in those counties. According to the investigators, approximately 4 to 7,000 excess cancers each year should be attributed to PFAS exposure. Males and females respond somewhat differently, however. Males in counties with contaminated drinking water are more susceptible to leukemia and cancers of the brain, soft tissues, and urinary tract. Females are more likely to experience cancers of the thyroid, mouth, and throat, as well as soft tissues. The scientists urge regulators to monitor and possibly regulate these persistent compounds more intensely.
Have you ever eaten okra? A recent meta analysis of 9 controlled studies reveals that regular consumption of okra pods can lower total cholesterol, LDL, fasting blood glucose, and HbA1c. If okra were a drug, we suspect that many healthcare professionals would prescribe it. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. Nearly 7 million Americans are now suffering from Alzheimer's disease. The human toll is devastating, and the quest for an effective treatment has been intense.
Billions of dollars have been spent in developing drugs to remove amyloid plaque from the brain. But has this exclusive focus been based on questionable research?
To learn more about possible fraud in the research community, we turn to Dr. Matthew Schrag. He is assistant professor of neurology at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. However, Dr. Schrag's work on data and images in Alzheimer's disease research lies outside his employment with Vanderbilt University.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Matthew Schrag.
Hi, I'm pleased to join you today.
We are delighted to have you back. Dr. Schrag, we've been following your work very closely for many years now. Neuroscientists have been searching, for a treatment against Alzheimer's disease for decades. But in the last few years, there's finally been some good news. 3 new medications approved by the FDA, aducanumab, lecanemab, and donanemab, all, those MABs tell us, Terry, it's a
monoclonal antibody.
And they all remove amyloid beta from the brain, which seemed like a good idea. But your data has sort of questioned, in some respects, the underlying amyloid hypothesis. It's raised important questions. What can you tell us about your findings of that original research?
Well, the concept that beta amyloid causes Alzheimer's disease has been the leading hypothesis for probably about 30 years now. And most of these experimental treatments and these newer antibodies on the market focus on trying to remove beta amyloid from the brain because a lot of people believe that's the first domino in a string of dominoes that lead to neurodegeneration and the loss of people's memories. But what we've been learning over the last several decades is that the story is likely much more complicated than that. And maybe that's not surprising. Most diseases of aging don't have a single cause. And so this hypothesis that beta amyloid by itself is the cause of the disease is coming under a lot of scrutiny. The clinical trials that have come out over the last several years definitely are able to show that these drugs are able to remove beta amyloid. And yet, when we look at how patients do when they're treated with these drugs, their memories don't really improve. In fact, the drugs barely perceptibly slow the progression of the disease. And so it's led us and many others to conclude that this strategy of removing beta amyloid is not going to be enough to produce game-changing results.
One of your first tip-offs to potentially something not quite right going on was when you looked into research by a company called Cassava Sciences. That company has developed a drug, Simufilam, and it has just recently drop the development of this drug?
Well, the phase 3 clinical trial was disappointing to say the least. And so we're sort of curious, what did your research into the quality of the data reveal?
So I was asked, I think about 3 years ago now, to look at this drug and the company behind it and assess the quality of the underlying science. And I found some disturbing problems when we did forensic image analysis. We found that a lot of the data supporting the development of that drug seemed to have been, or at least have some of the telltale signs of manipulation. And this would lead somebody to be pretty skeptical about the underlying science behind the drug. Consequently, we recommended that the FDA investigate the company and reevaluate whether or not this drug should continue in development. Surprisingly, the FDA permitted these clinical trials to progress, but not surprisingly, when the drug is founded on questionable or even potentially fraudulent data, the clinical trial performed poorly. And I think that that is sad but an expected result.
Dr. Schrag, you talk about image manipulation. Can you tell us why images are so important? What kinds of images?
Well, a lot of scientific experiments, the final step of that experiment is a photograph. You run some sort of analytical process. And in the case of cassava sciences, the vast majority were an experiment called a Western blot. And it leads to somebody being able to see how much of a particular protein is present in a sample and measuring how those samples change, whether levels are going up or down, or whether they're being molecularly altered, is critical to interpreting what a drug is doing. And so, if you take those photographic results and you make the images brighter or darker, or add in other features or take them away, you can change the interpretation of the underlying data. And when Photoshop came along 25 years ago or so, that became much easier to do. And so, what we've been focused on is trying to identify some of these telltale forensic signs in images that allow us to pick up hints that the images might have been adjusted from their native natural state. In the case of cassava sciences, there were just piles and piles of these types of changes.
So, Dr. Schrag, if the anti amyloid medications that have been approved by the FDA have not been very effective and certainly have not reversed Alzheimer's disease, are there some downsides to them? Because these drugs are incredibly expensive. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars a year, not including the PET scans that have to be done to check for potential problems. So tell us a little bit about this issue of brain bleeds, microhemorrhaging, and something else called brain atrophy.
You know, in every treatment decision in medicine, we ask the question not just is this treatment helpful, but we want to get a sense of the ratio of the help versus the harm of a treatment, right? We call that the risk benefit ratio. And so I often tell people that even if it's a small effect on people's memory, it could be a perfectly acceptable drug if it's very safe and it's inexpensive. So if we could get this kind of an effect by asking a patient to take a vitamin, I'd be delighted by it. The problem with these new antibody drugs is that they are, as you alluded to, very expensive, but they're also potentially quite dangerous. Depending on the antibody and somebody's genetic background, the risks of having significant side effects can be anywhere from 20 to 40%. Patients are at risk of developing swelling of the brain and bleeding of the brain. And in a small percentage of patients, fortunately small, but it can be quite serious. So, roughly 1% of patients taken in aggregate suffer significant bleeding or swelling side effects of the brain. And that creates some risk that has to be taken into account when we're considering using these drugs.
Well, certainly, it sounds as though having bleeding in your brain, regardless of who you are, whether you have cognitive function problems, that can't be a good thing.
Absolutely not. No, that's right. And in many cases, the patients who suffered these bleedings, had very tiny areas of bleeding, pinprick size areas of bleeding. But in a non-trivial number, in 1 or 2% of cases, patients had much more significant events. And there have been some fatalities related to swelling and bleeding of the brain. And so these decisions to take this drug are not trivial decisions. And you have to consider that carefully in view of the very small benefits that these treatments offer.
So, Dr. Schrag, as you look at the neuroscience community and its emphasis on amyloid beta, with not much to show for it over the last 20 or 30 years, what other areas interest you looking into that crystal ball and the future of Alzheimer's disease research?
Oh, I think that's the right question. We should now be asking, what's the next generation of treatment going to look like? And I think that we can anchor that conversation by looking at the brain tissue of somebody with Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease or ALS or any of these other neurodegenerative diseases. We see something very consistent across that spectrum, that these are all diseases where the brain has trouble managing its waste products. And the specific waste product that's accumulating in the brain and where exactly in the brain it's accumulating defines the flavor of the neurodegenerative disorder. But they all have this in common. And so I think we're starting to focus more than asking, how do we get rid of beta amyloid or alpha synuclein or any of these other waste products? Starting to ask the question, why are they accumulating there in the first place? And are there treatments that we can develop that will help the brain to manage its waste products more efficiently? And so to do that, we're focusing on a couple of things. One is the function of the blood vessels. A lot of waste products get out of the brain by passing through the blood vessels. So as the blood vessels deteriorate, you see more and more sluggishness of the brain's ability to control those waste products. So targeting the blood vessels may be helpful. We don't really think of Alzheimer's disease as a blood vessel disease, but that's definitely a big part of the story. And you see that in the side effects that these patients are suffering with these treatments. When you give somebody an anti-amyloid therapy, it seems to be pushing beta amyloid out of the brain through the blood vessels and damaging the blood vessels in the process. And that's where a lot of these side effects are coming from. So the next generation of therapies, we should really be looking for things that improve both facets of the disease, things that help to clear plaques, but also protect the blood vessels. Another area we're watching closely is inflammation. A lot of neurodegenerative disorders have low levels of smoldering inflammation, and that may be targetable. That may be the sort of pathway that could have an effect across multiple neurodegenerative diseases. And there's a handful of other pathways along these lines that I think could be productive.
Dr. Matthew Schrag, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
It's been my pleasure.
You've been listening to Dr. Matthew Schrag, Assistant Professor of Neurology at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. His work on evaluating Alzheimer's disease research has been carried out independently of his university responsibilities.
After the break, we'll talk with journalist Charles Piller. His groundbreaking story in science first alerted us to Dr. Schrag's findings.
Now, Charles Piller has written a book about the shortcuts and data manipulation that he and Schrag uncovered in this field.
We'll find out how the dominance of the amyloid hypothesis has affected research in the entire area of studying causes and treatments of dementia.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This podcast is made possible in part by CocoVia, backed by 20 years of scientific research and the maker of the most proven and concentrated flavanol extract in the market today, Coco Pro Cocoa Extract. Cocoa flavanols are among the most studied plant-based bioactives today and are clinically proven to promote cardiovascular and brain health for the long term, supporting a strong heart and better memory.
Get 15% off your order of any CocoVia product by using the discount code PPOD15. Learn more at CocoVia, and remember that discount code is PPOD15.
These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by CocoVia dietary supplements. CocoVia Memory Plus is formulated with 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols, a level clinically proven to improve 3 different types of memory and support brain function. More information at cocovia.com.
You just heard from Dr. Matthew Schrag, a neurologist who's been instrumental in identifying some worrisome data anomalies in important studies of Alzheimer's disease. Now we turn to investigative journalist Charles Piller, who wrote a groundbreaking article for Science magazine highlighting Dr. Schrag's findings.
Charles Piller and Dr. Matthew Schrag have spent the last few years reviewing some foundational Alzheimer research. In particular, they've focused on amyloid beta, the sticky plaque associated with Alzheimer dementia. Drug development has focused almost exclusively on this substance.
The Food and Drug Administration has approved 3 drugs, aducanumab, lecanemab, and donanemab. These compounds are extremely effective at removing amyloid from the brain, but the clinical benefits are modest at best.
To learn more about this tale of woe and intrigue, we turn to Charles Piller. He's written in-depth stories for Science magazine where he often exposes misconduct and problematic practices with scientific research. They often focus on public health issues like the study of Alzheimer's disease. Charles Piller is the author of Gene Wars and The Fail-Safe Society. His most recent book is Doctored: Fraud, Arrogance, and Tragedy in the Quest to Cure Alzheimer's.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Charles Piller.
I'm so happy to be with you.
Charles, we're delighted to talk with you. We just spoke with Dr. Matthew Schrag about his research into the amyloid hypothesis and the images that showed signs of having been manipulated. You broke this story in the pages of what I think is one of the most prestigious journals that exists, Science. How did you get interested in Dr. Schrag and his work?
Well, I'm an investigative reporter, and like so many stories that I do, it came to me through a tip. Actually, it was someone in the field who knew Dr. Schrag and said, this is something you might be interested in looking more deeply into. It involved a case of possible, in fact, later sort of proven image manipulation associated with a Alzheimer's drug called Simufilm from a company called Cassava Sciences. And that set me on my way to a relationship with Dr. Schrag that evolved over many months and now even years.
Would you tell us a little bit more about Dr. Matthew Schrag? Why is his story so unusual?
He's an interesting guy for a few reasons. One is that he is someone who's keenly interested in research integrity, but unlike many people who sort of pay lip service to that goal, which is a goal that all of us can support, he has taken personal risks in his career to aggressively go after episodes of possible misconduct that he's observed through his own expertise in neuroscience and his expert ability to examine images forensically to see if they might have been manipulated. If I may add, the reason why it was kind of hazardous to Dr. Schrag's career is as a relatively junior scientist during most of this period, he wasn't tenured, and he was going after cases that involved some of the most illustrious researchers and journals and funding authorities in his field. So when you're calling into question those kinds of authorities, it's really kind of a hazardous profession for a person of his standing new in the career.
Now, Charles, you describe this as the most disturbing story of your career as an investigative journalist. What makes it so upsetting?
Well, I'm a person who believes deeply in the importance of scientific research. I believe deeply in, as the saying goes, trusting the science. But what I've found in the course of the last few years of investigating the uh, amount and severity of apparently doctored research in Alzheimer's is that that sort of trust in science is something that you can't take for granted. You must verify it. And there are incentive structures built into both science itself and in Alzheimer's in particular that I think have resulted in a degree of corruption of the field that is disturbing. Now, I want to make it clear, if I may, that that doesn't mean that all Alzheimer's research is corrupted. It doesn't mean that all scientists are not to be trusted. I think, like any field, only a small percentage of people have improper motives and have engaged in possibly corrupt behavior. But in a field like Alzheimer's, we've seen that even a relatively small number can skew the field in certain ways that have very terrible effects more generally.
You say that the way that incentives are structured can contribute to the problem. And I'm wondering, you do get into that in your wonderful book, Doctored, but I'm wondering if you can just give us a brief overview of what some of those incentives might be.
Well, one example is the way in which the publisher parish incentive and imperative in academic research is what the way it functions, so that a lot of scientists know that the volume of material that can get published in journals is basically the deciding factor on whether they'll succeed and flourish in their chosen career. And as a result, the tremendous pressure to publish can sometimes lead to people cutting corners. So that's one element of the incentive structure that I think needs to change. The other is that the demand for getting funding to support yourself as a scientist is very intense, and the competition is incredibly intense. And as a result, again, uh, because of this way in which the funding relationship between academics and the federal government and other funding sources operates, it means that people are incentivized to do things that maybe skirt the lines a bit of ethical conduct in order to be able to remain in their chosen profession and to be well funded in studies that they're interested in. There's a kind of a psychological process that I think might be part of the problem. I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not diagnosing anyone, but I have observed this a lot, and I could describe that as well.
Well, Charles Piller, let's cut to the chase, if we may. How did the amyloid cascade hypothesis, which is the foundation and has been the foundation for decades of the whole approach to Alzheimer's disease and all of the research to develop new drugs, how did that come to dominate neuroscience? You talk a little bit about the amyloid mafia. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is that there is a large number of extremely powerful people in the field, scientists, funders, corporations, also even patient advocacy organizations who have adopted the amyloid hypothesis as central to the problem in such a way that it has tended to crowd out other creative ideas about how to approach Alzheimer's and possibly find remedies that would be effective for this terrible disease. So, if I could take a step back really to the very beginning for just a second, Alzheimer's disease was discovered by this scientist in Germany by the name of Alois Alzheimer. And the characteristics that he noticed were these buildup of amyloid proteins in the brain, and also these other proteins called tau that are tangled masses of protein inside nerve cells in the brain. And so he's the one who described Alzheimer's initially as a disease that has those two characteristics biologically and also cognitive decline. So, those three characteristics. And this was essentially adopted by the field. And um, it makes some logical sense because among people who have Alzheimer's disease, generally, if they pass away and there's an autopsy conducted, those proteins are found in their brain. The problem is that there are many contradictions within the amyloid hypothesis. One being that these proteins, particularly amyloid, but also tau, are often found in the brains of people who passed away after suffering no cognitive decline. In other words, people who were never diagnosed with Alzheimer's because they didn't have it, yet they also had those proteins in their brain. And so a lot of skeptics of the amyloid hypothesis feel that this super concentration of funding, mind share, research, and advocacy on this one idea has been deleterious to the field because it has tended to make other ideas seem marginal when they just haven't gotten enough attention to really explore them fully.
So, if I understand what you're saying, Charles, is that there's not a one-to-one correspondence between having amyloid plaque in your brain and having severe cognitive decline.
Absolutely right. There is no direct correspondence, even though it's very characteristic of people with Alzheimer's, of course, to have those amyloid plaques in their brain and other forms of amyloid protein.
What is the effect on research in the field generally of the dominance of this hypothesis?
Well, I think because the vast majority of research funding for many years has gone towards ideas, research, and drug development associated with the amyloid hypothesis, certain other ideas. For example, the possibility that there may be an infectious element to or cause of Alzheimer's disease, the idea that inflammation in the brain caused by possibly a variety of conditions or sources might have a role to play in the development of Alzheimer's. Also, the importance of preventive health aspects of the disease, perhaps not getting the attention that they deserve. Uh, all of these things have been starved for attention and funding over the years as a result of the dominance of the so-called amyloid hypothesis. And you might ask, well, why is this? Why is it so important to people? And there, I think, are two, among several answers, there's two very important ones. One is that you have some very powerful, creative, and thoughtful people in the field who have based their entire scientific careers on the idea of proving out the amyloid hypothesis. And they're very reluctant to be budged from that, regardless of what evidence there might be. For example, the failure after failure after failure of drug development associated with this hypothesis, resulting in the approval of only a very tiny number of drugs that have minute, if any, benefit for Alzheimer's patients and also have grave risks associated with them. So that's one, it's the career incentives of powerful thought, sometimes very thoughtful, but very entrenched people in the field. The second is that drug companies have enormous amount of sunk costs into this idea. And when you invest billions of dollars literally into this one way of approaching the disease, it can be very hard to shift off that. You keep wanting to somehow make that investment worthwhile. And that's what we've seen in drug development to a large degree.
Charles, your book is titled Doctored, and the subtitle, so to speak, is Fraud, Arrogance, and Tragedy in the Quest to Cure Alzheimer's Disease. And I'm kind of curious about where Matthew Schrag, Dr. Schrag, fits into all of this and why his discovery has kind of challenged that house of cards.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. I think Dr. Schrag's involvement in this is central. I would regard him as the most important whistleblower in the history of Alzheimer's disease. And really the genesis of it was that he was central to challenging research behind a drug that was being promoted by this company, Cassava Sciences, and this drug, Simufilm, which is now pretty much dead. The drug failed in clinical trials. But in exposing some of the problems there, he became interested in exploring more broadly the question of Alzheimer's research. And this is where I became connected to him. And he and I looked closely at this set of research that was conducted by researchers at the University of Minnesota. And so, just to take it back one little step, is that there was a period where uh, the amyloid hypothesis had come into question because of the failures of drug development. And back in 2006, a profound experiment was conducted that restored a lot of people's faith in the amyloid hypothesis. And this was an animal experiment conducted at the University of Minnesota. And when Dr. Schrag started to look at studies associated with that experiment, what he found was that in the central experiment itself and in some subsidiary studies, that many of the central images of the experimentation had been digitally manipulated, or at least it appeared so. And this resulted in an expose that I wrote in Science Magazine based on Dr. Schrag's work that was validated by other expert forensic image analysts and also validated by some of the most renowned minds in the Alzheimer's field. And what everyone concluded was that this central experiment, one that had injected new hope in the amyloid hypothesis, was indeed based on improper manipulation of images. And in fact, that study was 2 years later was retracted by the journal Nature, which is one of the most prestigious journals in the world. So this was the genesis of it. And then Schrag, who is an intrepid guy, went ahead and began to look at other things in conjunction with the work that I was doing for my book and also for other articles in Science Magazine. And in a sense, we worked together, although he was, I'm not an expert in this image forensic analysis, and I'm not an expert in Alzheimer's, except insofar as someone who studies it intensively for a few years can become. And with his expertise and the expertise of others who joined this effort, uh, it became clear that an incredible array of research was suspect as well.
You're listening to Charles Piller, an investigative journalist known for his work in the field of science. His in-depth stories for Science Magazine have often exposed misconduct and problematic practices within scientific research, such as the study of Alzheimer's disease. Charles Piller is the author of Gene Wars and The Fail-Safe Society. His brand new book is Doctored: Fraud, Arrogance, and Tragedy in the Quest to Cure Alzheimer's.
It's time for a short break. Then we'll hear about the history of whistleblowing and the risks for the whistleblowers.
Dr. Schrag was not the only expert to examine the suspect images.
The FDA approved Aduhelm to treat Alzheimer's disease, even though its own expert panel advised against it. Why?
Drugs that remove amyloid have some serious side effects. What are they?
We'll also learn what Charles Piller sees as the future for research into Alzheimer's disease.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. Are you ready to move easily and independently without pain or stiffness holding you back? Do you want to look in the mirror and see a plump, hydrated glow instead of more fine lines and wrinkles? Discover Native Path Collagen, made with only type 1 and 3 collagen fibers, the two most important types that make up 90% of the collagen in your body. Found in your cartilage, bones, skin, hair, nails, and gut, types 1 and 3 provide maximum benefits without the need for unnecessary fillers.
Native Path Collagen is a single ingredient formula with no fillers, additives, or artificial sweeteners, Plus, it's third-party tested for heavy metals, ensuring purity and safety.
Completely flavorless, Native Path collagen can be added to anything coffee, smoothies, soups, you name it. Its peptide formula makes it more bioavailable, meaning it's absorbed more easily and mixes perfectly without clumping.
And the best part? Native Path offers amazing bundle deals. With this special link, you can get 3 or 6 packs at a fraction of the price of other brands.
With over 4 million jars sold, 1 million happy customers, 8,000 five-star reviews, and a 365-day no-risk guarantee, Native Path is a trusted choice. Plus, they offer an 800 number for any questions about usage, recipes, or ingredients. And you'll speak to a real person ready to help.
Join their private Facebook community to share success stories, recipes, and support each other on this journey called life.
Visit getnativepath.com/ppod and start your transformation today. That is GetNativePath.com/ppod.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by CocoVia dietary supplements, cocoflavanol supplements that support cognitive and cardiovascular health, made with a proven concentrated flavanol extract. More information at cocovia.com.
Today we're discussing the evidence of scientific misconduct in some research on Alzheimer's disease. How was this uncovered? What are the consequences for scientists, doctors, and most importantly, patients and their families?
We're talking with Charles Piller, a prominent investigative journalist primarily known for his work in the field of science. He often writes in-depth stories for Science magazine that expose misconduct and problematic practices within scientific research. His most recent book is Doctored: Fraud, Arrogance, and Tragedy in the Quest to Cure Alzheimer's.
Charles Piller, as an investigative reporter, you have doubtless had contact with other whistleblowers over time. Whistleblowers often don't have a good life after they start blowing that whistle. And you even kind of alluded to that when you were talking with Dr. Schrag. You said the history of whistleblowing is, and he said, littered with corpses. Please tell us what that's about.
Well, let me say, first of all, that yes, it's true that whistleblowers have actually been murdered, but that's pretty rare. So I actually never feared for Dr. Schrag's life in his many examples of sticking his neck out on these subjects. That said, whistleblowers in general have had a lot of difficulty. It's kind of a thankless task, in part because um, when you challenge institutional authorities, and in this case, what I mean is journals, universities, eminent scientists in your field, and funders that you yourself depend on, those are pretty risky things to do. And people's careers have been thrown into disarray. Sometimes people have had terrible consequences and even lost their jobs in the cause of doing something that I think all of us could agree is vital for our scientific process and really vital for society as a whole to have these courageous people take risks. So one of the things that Dr. Schrag and I talked about many times and had to go over a lot was whether he would be named in my Stories in Science magazine or in my book. And the reason why we had these conversations is that as an investigative reporter, I regard it as my ethical responsibility to ensure that sources like Dr. Schrag understand the risks that they might be running, and whether by staying anonymous or being named, how that changes their risk ratio. but being named is a source for this kind of work is especially risky. And I very much wanted Dr. Schrag to be named in the story, but I also wanted to be straight with him about the risks he was running. And fortunately, I think he did agree to be named because then we were able to tell the story of his journey, his experience, and the risks and rewards that are associated with doing that sort of work.
And you do a great job telling the story of his journey and his ability to identify these images that are not what they claim to be. But he's not the only one. You also contacted other people to essentially verify his work. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I trust Dr. Schrag. I think he's brilliant. But that said, you can't really go forward with any sort of investigative article like this, especially one with the consequences that some of my work has had. In other words, consequences including changing or destroying someone's career when the concerns about possible scientific misconduct arise. Those are very serious things, and you have to get it validated a bunch of different ways. And for me, what that means is one, I take his findings and the findings of other forensic image experts with whom I have consulted, and I get them vetted by independent authorities so that no one is going forward with an article or a book that says one person thinks thus and so. It's always a kind of general agreement among a variety of experts. That's step one. And step two is that you need to go to experts in the field of neuroscience, experts in Alzheimer's disease, who understand the meaningfulness of possible image manipulation to the scientific truthfulness of those experiments and what their impact might be on the field. And so for me, it was always a two-step process. One, validate the concerns associated with the image manipulation. And two, find out the importance of this and the meaningfulness of it from people in the field who have the authoritative perspective to be able to say something that the rest of the field would pay attention to.
Right. Now, Charles, we have seen headlines that have shouted breakthrough for Alzheimer's disease, and that involves a drug called aducanumab. The brand name was Aduhelm. That was first approved several years ago, even though there was an article in JAMA that suggested the drug wasn't that great. And in fact, a study had been terminated for futility, in quotes. So, how is it that the Food and Drug Administration approved aducanumab for Alzheimer's disease, even though its own advisory committee, its outside experts, said no dice? Let's not do that. And not only did they approve aducanumab, but they've gone on to approve other anti-Alzheimer drugs, lecanemab and donanemab. These are costly drugs. Tell us about the medications. Tell us about the FDA. Give us a quick thumbnail of how the outside experts reacted to those approvals.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's very, very important. I think listeners might have heard of these drugs by their brand names. The lecanemabs is Leqembi, and the brand new one recently approved by FDA is Kisunla. And these are all very similar drugs. What they do is they're antibody drugs. So the immune system of our body produces antibodies to fight off illnesses, viruses, bacteria, etc. And these are antibodies that are created in the lab and then injected. So they're kind of a what they call passive immunization. So they attack amyloid in the brain, but they're not creating an immune response in the body overall. And so you have to have repeated administration of these drugs. The problem with these drugs, and this is why they have been controversial, is that they uh, provide a statistically significant slowing of cognitive decline. So that means they do not cure Alzheimer's. They do not reverse any of the effects of Alzheimer's. They do not stop the decline in cognitive abilities that Alzheimer's causes. What they do is that they, to a statistically significant degree, very slightly slow the decline of cognition compared to a placebo that people in the studies associated with this drugs received. Now, what does that really mean in real life? Well, what it means is that even though there was a statistical observation, the clinical observation of doctors, patients, family members is that the degree of slowing of cognitive decline is so small that many patients and their family members and their clinicians wouldn't even notice it. So we're talking about a very minute change. Secondly, these drugs pose serious hazards, including brain swelling and bleeding. Now, these are hazards that can cause death. And as a result, the FDA only approved these new drugs with what they call their black box warning on the product label. And this is the highest level of warning, risk of death from these drugs. And the thing that I think has been most frustrating for many people in the field, and something that I have covered extensively in my own work, is that the companies that were involved in testing these drugs and bringing them to market were not really as forthcoming about the risks as they could have been. For example, the deaths associated with these drugs were in some cases were exposed first by me in the pages of Science magazine, not by the companies. And the companies have not fully shared data associated with the drugs so that independent investigators can really understand what the risks and benefits of the drugs are. So uh, I would just say that these are examples of a very lackluster, at best, performance of drugs that have had billions and billions in development behind them. And it's why I think there's a lot of distrust in the field of the conventional wisdom.
I think, the drug companies did something else. They came up with a new acronym for the problems that they were spotting on imaging of these patients' brains. They call it ARIA, which is what? Um,
Yeah, it's amyloid related imaging abnormality.
there you go. Doesn't sound too scary, and yet
No.
what does it mean?
Well, this is really, I think, a pretty shocking thing to me, which is that they decided to call brain swelling and bleeding by this term that is reminiscent of a night out at the opera. And
Right.
it's a very perplexing kind of way of warning people against something that can cause death. So I would say that this is again an element of the way in which ideas about the effectiveness and dangers of these drugs have not been well described to the patients and their family members who are caring for them, and even to clinicians. And it's part of, I think, an overall idea within the field that these are the best we can get. These are vitally important, and they're the inevitable future of Alzheimer's research and development. And I think that's something that again more and more people in the field are beginning to take exception with and try to promote other alternatives to.
We hope so. One other thing that these drugs seem to do, in addition to potentially causing brain swelling, potentially causing brain bleeding, neither of which is a good thing, if you look over a long enough period of time, they also can cause brain shrinkage. Again, not a good thing.
No, and thank you for raising that. I think the interesting thing about that is that Alzheimer's itself and some other neurological illnesses cause brain shrinkage. And if you look at the autopsies or other even brain scans of people who have taken these drugs, what they found is that these drugs cause brain shrinkage at a more rapid rate than the disease itself. So, what does that mean? Well, really no one knows for sure what it means. Advocates of the drug say it doesn't mean anything. It's fine. Don't worry about your brain shrinking at a faster rate. But critics who are concerned about this brain shrinkage, including some of the leading experts in this field, have raised questions about what the longer term effects might be of these drugs and whether their safety profile needs to be adjusted.
Charles, we are just about out of time, and I'd like you to put on your investigative journalist hat for just a moment and tell us what you think the future holds for Alzheimer's disease research. Where are we headed? What does your book and Dr. Matthew Schragg's research portend for the future of the amyloid hypothesis? And what else might evolve if this one eventually crashes and burns and kind of changes the direction of future research?
Well, I would just say that right now, there's, first of all, let me say that even skeptics of the amyloid hypothesis don't think that amyloid has nothing to do with Alzheimer's disease. It's clear that there's an element of this complex problem that is influenced by amyloid proteins. And so uh, it doesn't mean completely eliminating all research on amyloids in order to make progress. But I think it's necessary for the field to open up to other ideas. And some of the other ideas that I think are gaining credence and might result in interesting new research in the very near future are one, the idea that infections, even latent infections from things called the herpesvirus and others, herpes virus, might have an effect on Alzheimer's, might be interrelated with other factors that might cause Alzheimer's. And the studies that are underway now might shed more light on that soon. The second thing that I would say is interesting and perhaps encouraging is that there's signs that the GLP-1 inhibitors, these are the sort of weight loss drugs that have been found to have potentially other beneficial effects in people in the last few years, could also be something that could be helpful in dementia, again, related to reducing inflammation, and which is something that many people think is critical to understanding Alzheimer's. The last thing I wanted to leave people with is the idea that healthful lifestyles, good diets, taking care of yourself is not a cure for Alzheimer's. It's not an essential thing that can absolutely prevent the disease from occurring. But these are things that we should all be mindful of because even people who do develop Alzheimer's, if they have healthy lifestyles, if they eat a good diet, if they take care to examine and monitor their blood pressure and cholesterol levels and to treat diabetes and other things that tend to be risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, then the degree of disease that they might eventually have, the speed with which it harms them and causes cognitive decline can be mitigated to some degree. And so you're not completely helpless in this case. You should try to take care of yourself as well.
Charles Pillar, I'd like you to give us a little insight into the Food and Drug Administration because they have been active participants in this whole process of the amyloid hypothesis and the approval of these medications that are so effective at lowering amyloid levels but not making much difference in clinical outcomes. And I guess the first question has to do with the relationship between the Food and Drug Administration and the industry that theoretically it's responsible for regulating. Tell us a bit about the person who was in charge of CEDAR, and you'll tell us what CEDAR is at the Food and Drug Administration and why it raises some red flags.
Sure. So you're referring to a guy by the name of Billy Dunn, who was instrumental in bringing forward some of the anti-amyloid antibody drugs that have been recently approved. And his part of FDA CEDAR is the drug development and approval section of the agency. They have also other elements of their programs that involve devices. And I would just say there are a few problems with FDA that I think are really ripe for reform. And when I say reform, I want to just say, first of all, that I think the FDA is one of the most important agencies in the government, and that historically they have been essential to keeping the food and drug process in our country relatively safe and effective for patients, for consumers, and relative to other agencies in other countries, often superior. So I don't want to be seen as someone who's just trashing the FDA because even though they have big problems, they've also done good things. But let me just say some of the problems with the FDA that I see. One is that the agency is funded by these companies to evaluate the company's drugs for approval. Now, that right off the bat creates an inherent conflict of interest. I think it would be far better for Congress to fund the FDA for a few $1 billion to actually manage their own process in a way where they didn't have to be taking the money directly from the drug companies that they're evaluating. Second, there's something called a revolving door between the FDA and the drug companies. So people who are evaluating particular companies or industries for a kind of research, you might see them a year or two later in very highly paid executive jobs within those same companies. And so there is a perverse set of incentives set up for regulators who we rely on for unbiased opinions about these drugs to favor companies, even if there are doubts and questions about the drugs they're evaluating. And I think we have certainly seen these problems be very important in regard to the development of anti-amyloid antibodies. Now, I can also address the question of Billy Dunn, the executive who was involved in the approval of Aduhelm and Leqembi. And Dunn is a guy, a very smart scientist who it was found, along with some colleagues, to have been deeply, deeply connected to the companies you might call back channel meetings associated with this drug Aduhelm, which was the first anti-amyloid antibody drug that was approved by FDA some years ago. And even a big congressional report found that this was highly questionable, if not highly improper. And why is this a problem? Well, you can't have a public agency be conducting back channel discussions and agreements with companies that they oversee the drug development of. And so it's very important for the agency to be aloof of those conflicted relationships. That's not the case now. And there's been a lot of controversy about what the new Trump administration will do with FDA. I just want to say that while I am, of course, concerned that they might do things that are, destructive of the agency, I also think the agency does need some reforms, and it's possible that they might be doing some beneficial things to enforce better practices there.
Charles Pillar, what can you tell us about the drugs that have in fact been approved? And let's start with aducanumab. What happened to it?
Well, Aduhelm was approved by FDA after some very controversial research that showed uh, kind of you might say, equivocal results in clinical experiments. And when I say clinical experiments, I mean tests with people taking the drugs. And what they found was that there was a very, very slight statistically significant change that slowed cognitive decline of some people in the experiment compared to a placebo that others in the experiment took. But this was contradicted by other experimentation by the same company. And yet, this drug was approved by FDA, even though it was quite controversial. Now, that said, the amount of benefit of the drug, despite the risks associated with it, and those are risks of brain swelling and bleeding that can cause death, the risk benefit ratio was so slim and perhaps unfavorable to the drug that Medicare, which is of course, the funding agency that would be footing the bill for most people who would be taking the drug refused to underwrite this drug. And consequently, that drug eventually was taken off the market. It just couldn't survive. Hardly anyone was taking it because it was costing people $26,000 a year for a drug with minimal, if any, benefit and grave risks associated with it. So that was Aduhelm. Uh, the next drug that came along, lecanemab, also known as Leqembi by its brand name, similarly, it had a kind of equivocal but very narrow, statistically significant benefit, but clinically very minor, if perceptible at all, benefit to patients with very grave risks associated with it. Yet this was approved and Medicare agreed to pay for it. So this kind of, in a way, the uh, situation with Aduhelm opened the floodgates for other anti-amyloid antibodies, kind of set the pattern for it, which was one of the things that was so alarming to advisors to the agency, so alarming to scientists in the field, that this would be the pattern set, and in fact it was. Now, let me just say that what happened with Leqembi? What was the result of it? Well, the result of it was that rather few people have taken the drug. Even though Medicare is paying for it, it's still very costly in copays to people who use that system of insurance. And additionally, there are numerous brain scans and other diagnostic tests that are necessary to ensure that it's used with relative safety and to catch problems as early as possible so that they don't become deadly problems. This this process has meant that the cost, the potential dangers, the potential liability for prescribing doctors has all resulted in a very, very low uptake of these drugs. Very few, just a few thousand people, as of the most recent reporting, have taken them, even though, in theory, more than 1 million people in the United States alone would be eligible to take these drugs. So I guess it's a cautionary tale about how hard it is to push these things over the finish line, even though they were approved by the agency.
Charles, you've talked about the FDA and some of the incentives that can make things less than perfectly straightforward at the Food and Drug Administration. I'd like to ask you about a different organization. It's non-governmental, and yet I think we may also see some incentives that mean it's not doing what it purports to do, and that would be the Alzheimer's Association.
Yeah, the Alzheimer's Association, which has done a lot of really excellent work, also has, in my view, had blinders on related to the amyloid hypothesis and support for companies who are developing these anti-amyloid antibody drugs. And just to give you an example, the organization is funded by a range of sources, but they take millions of dollars from the very companies that are developing these drugs. And consequently, I think it's worth asking the question, is this conflict of interest that they have affecting their advocacy of these drugs? Now, I can't look into the minds of the people in the Alzheimer's Association and what's precisely motivating them, but I can say that their emphasis on supporting these companies and supporting the drugs that they develop and and lobbying Congress, lobbying the FDA, and pressing forward patient stories of people who I think naively are brought in to argue from a personal perspective on the importance of developing these drugs has skewed thinking in the field in a way that perhaps has not been always to the benefit of people overall and to diversity of thought in the field.
Charles Piller, your book, Doctored, all about fraud, arrogance, and tragedy in the quest for a cure for Alzheimer's disease, has been revelatory. Have you learned anything post writing this book? Have you gotten any insights? Have you heard any more tips from insiders or whistleblowers that would in any way change your perspective?
Well, the short answer is no, nothing material. I don't think there's really anything on the horizon of the next few years, at the very least, that would alter any premise of my book. I I have kept up with the field quite closely, and I can say that listeners should stay tuned because I'm going to have other work that it describes other aspects of the Alzheimer's problem that has not yet been publicly known that I think will be quite interesting and add new insights into the range of questions and problems in the field. This is additional to the wide range of apparently falsified research that I describe in the book itself.
Charles Pillar, thanks so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to Charles Pillar, a prominent investigative journalist primarily known for his in-depth stories for Science magazine. Charles Pillar is the author of Gene Wars and The Fail-Safe Society. His most recent book is Doctored: Fraud, Arrogance, and Tragedy in the Quest to Cure Alzheimer's.
We spoke earlier with Dr. Matthew Schrag, Assistant Professor of Neurology at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. His work on research integrity lies outside his employment with Vanderbilt.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
This show is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, with the People's Pharmacy.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by CocoVia dietary supplements. CocoVia Cardio Health is offered in both convenient capsule and powder formats, with each serving containing 500 milligrams of cocoflavanols to support heart health. More information at cocovia.com.
Today's show is number 1416. You can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com. That's where you can share your comments about today's interview. You can also reach us through email, radio@peoplespharmacy.com.
Our interviews are available through your favorite podcast provider. You'll find the podcast on our website on Monday morning. This week, you'll find some extra questions and answers from our talk with Charles Pillar.
At peoplespharmacy.com, you can sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about important health stories. When you subscribe, you also have regular access to information about our weekly podcast, so you can find out ahead of time what topics we'll be covering. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show without you.